Hi, I'm Derri, and I've read it before. Today we're going to talk about the witches, and I'm going to admit up front that that's my favourite sub-series, mostly because the characters in these are some of the best realised amongst Discworld, and I've heard it said that the witches are some of the best characters, but they don't always get the strongest stories, and that's true to some extent. So I'm going to start talking just about the Witches series as a whole, and then I'm going to talk about Equal Rites, the first book, before leaving other later books for later episodes. The Witches sub-series comes in two parts really, and they do get split in a lot of places into two separate series. The first half that is separated into the official Witches books include Granny Weatherwax, Nanny Ogg, and Magrat Garlic. Magrat is Magrat because her mother couldn't spell. Later on, as these three witches go through things that, they're getting old, we start to see a few younger witches, and the last part of the Witches book often gets separated into its own, and those are the Tiffany Aching series that are marketed as YA. I'm not entirely sure why. Yes, Tiffany begins the story very young, but some of the themes in those books are surprisingly dark for YA audiences. But it doesn't ignore the older witches. They still are a part of those books, just a much smaller part than they have played to that point. So they're all witches books to my mind. And the witches books fill the part of Discworld with the fairy tale side of things. They're witches. This seems like a logical thing. The concept of storytelling and how that impacts the person telling the story as well as the person taking in the story is touched on really strongly. The power that story has to change reality because of the way it changes people's minds, and that then leads into how the control of the mind is so fundamental to humanity. One of the basic elements of Granny Weatherwax's character is her use of what she calls headology. In modern parlance, we would call that psychology, common sense, using people's brains to work in their favour. Granny Weatherwax, she goes through a couple of different phases. Early in the books, in fact her first book, which I'll talk more about in a minute, Equal Rites, she's far more of the traditional fairy tale story witch. She's a little more haggard, she's said to have warty hands, and that's not her final form. As I mentioned in my very first video, those first few books, Discworld hadn't found its feet quite yet, and among that is some of those characters. So while you do meet Granny Weatherwax in Equal Rites, you're not meeting the real Granny Weatherwax, which will make sense later when you read into the later books, when her character becomes far more fully formed. One of the things that becomes a frequent descriptor is that in a good light she could look handsome. She's tried to have warts, and she can't magic herself to have warts. She has a beautiful complexion. She is incredibly proud. She is incredibly stubborn. And she is not the head witch, because witches don't have head witches. Granny wouldn't allow them to. Then we have Nanny Ogg. And Nanny Ogg is not a traditional witch. She doesn't live in a cottage in the middle of the forest. She doesn't have the hooked nose and fearsome expression. She is a dumpy old lady with curly hair who has had lots of husbands, has had lots of children, and she has a filthy mind, and she likes a drink, and she smokes, and she has, horror of horrors, red boots. She is very earthy. She is, if you are very lucky, she is a woman that you have got somewhere in your life. She's an auntie or a gran. She's the one that people always get a bit frightened of if they have a drink at a party, because you just never know what's going to come out of their mouths. She knows everybody, and she knows everybody's history, and that's almost her superpower. She's able to just listen and figure out what's going on. She's confident about everything. She will fake her way through anything, and she's just glorious. I love Nanny. And the final of our three witches is Magrat Garlic, and we've gone through the very traditional black cloaked, hooked nose, fierce witch in the woods, to almost the sort of fairy godmothery kind of loving witch who lives near her family. And Magrat kind of completes the triad with a kind of hippy dippy airy fairy kind of crystals and bangles and tarot cards kind of witch. She's a wet hen, and there are times even she will admit that she can be a bit of a wet hen. And to hear all of this, you would think, well, are they witches? Are they magical? And the answer is absolutely. They are absolutely witches. They are absolutely magical. But because they're witches, they tend not to use magic very often, because it comes with a price. And sometimes that price comes from inside your own head. The reference material that Terry leans into the most heavily for the witches are stories. They're the fairy tales, they're the folk tales, they're the myths, they're the legends. And so you see things like the Green Man from early Anglo tradition. You see the Wild Hunt, and the Fae obviously are a big deal. They talk a lot about theatre. Again, storytelling is a huge theme, so you get a lot of references to Shakespeare, and entire books in their case are often sort of, not directly, but are often very pointedly at specific things from our literary culture. Weird Sisters is a conglomerate of Shakespeare and Shakespearean type themes and storylines. Masquerade it's the Phantom of the Opera. Witches Abroad is a lot of the Disney style fairy tales. Those traditions are played on heavily. And I think of a lot of the books in Discworld, Witches is probably the most accessible to new readers, because even though it's referenced in some of the oldest material, they're also the most well known. Kids today know the story of Cinderella. Kids today know about the Frog Prince. They know these references. So even the youngest new readers coming into Discworld will be able to get those references and catch those jokes and catch those nods and winks to how that story should play out. And for me, that's heartening, obviously, because it makes an entire branch of this world that I adore so easily consumed by new readers. And that's the world of the older witches. They're in the mountains. They're based sort of around Lancre. When the witches' stories branch off into the Tiffany stories, Tiffany doesn't live in the mountains. Tiffany lives down on the chalky plains, and they're called the Downlands, but you have to go up to the Downlands. So even though she's not in the mountains, she's up on the Downlands. And it's an odd, well, it's not really odd, I suppose, it's perfectly logical. We're stepping into a new generation. We're stepping into, she's the youngest current witch, and we get her origin story as a witch, and it's delightful and includes a frying pan and using her baby brother as bait. And the relationships that she forms with the older witches, the relationships that she forms, or has to rather reform, in her family once she begins taking up witching, because everyone has to sort of shuffle around this new power dynamic in the family. The Tiffany stories aren't as light and fluffy as they look like on the outside. I'll put it that way. The Tiffany stories also come with some of my favourite characters, in the form of the Knack-Mack Feegle. They are a cross between Smurfs and Highland warriors from Braveheart. They are well, they're funny, and I will let you encounter them when you do. And the only other character I can think of that I need to talk about for the witches is Grebo. And Grebo is Nanny Ogg's cat. Why is Grebo a character? Because he's a character. He, through dint of much effort, is the father of something like 16 generations worth of cats in Lancre. He's old, beaten up, scarred, scruffy, and frightens bears. And smells. But that's The Witches as a series. So, the first book in the Witches series you may be a little confused about, because a lot of reading orders will tell you that the first book in the Witches series is Weird Sisters, which is a better place to start, personally. But really, the earliest Witches book is Equal Rites. It's about a little girl who is the 7th child of a... Sorry, not the 7th, this is Discworld, the magic number is 8. This is about a little girl who is the 8th child of an 8th son. A wizard is about to shuffle off his mortal coil and decides that he's going to give his wizard's staff to this expected child, who after 7 sons you expect to be an 8th son. So this child is gifted this wizard's staff as the old wizard dies, only for the ghost of that wizard to go, oh dear, it's a girl. So immediately we start playing with the concept of, well, what is the difference between a witch and a wizard? And why can't a girl be a wizard? And why can't a boy be a witch? And why should this upset people? We see this little girl grow up, we see her find her magics, and we see Granny in her initial form. As I said, she will grow into her final form. We see Granny in her initial form take Esk under her wing and try and teach her how to be a witch, because she's the magical person who happens to be a girl, so she has to be a witch. It doesn't go smoothly. And then we have the adventure of this little girl and Granny trying to get her into the wizard's college, because clearly she has wizard's magic, which has a different operating system than witches, and she needs to learn how to control it. And so it's a wonderful take on both gender expectations and how what you learn changes the way your brain operates, and how the framework in your brain can be influenced, and that you can't measure another person's wheat with your own bushel. Everybody has a skill that they're particularly good at. Anyway, so Equal Rites is, as the story tells you, this is about a girl in a male situation and how that dynamic works. There is a magical foe that needs beating. There is some confrontations magically. There's stuff that's funny. And because it's such an early Discworld book, it's difficult to kind of say it's one thing or another. Part of it is poking fun of itself, part of it is still poking fun at the genre as a whole, and some of it is starting to move toward what the Witches books will become in looking at the power of expectation, of story, of what should happen. And I actually don't mind Equal Rites. I think it's quite a good book. But if you are looking to start The Witches, be aware that it's got a slightly different flavour. So be ready to make a new first impression when you move on from Equal Rites and into Weird Sisters. Please please subscribe. It makes a huge difference. And with that, I'm going to love you and leave you. And I'll see you next time.